Hi everyone, and welcome again to our sewing room. Today I'm going to take you through the new Pattern Emporium The Works tank top. It's got, as usual, Pattern Emporium patterns have lots of different style options. So this is the plain tank that I'm wearing. You do have gathered ruche sides and some tie sides as well. So have a bit of fun with the pattern. I'll pop the link in the comments so that you can grab your own copy. This pattern is really all about this wide binding. So it's a beautiful, nice wide binding that sits around the neckline and the sleeves. It is just a tank top, so there are no sleeve options with this pattern. Today I've made mine out of rayon spandex, so you can see that it's quite stretchy in both directions. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So again, measure your sizes and check off against the pattern as to what size you need to print. It's a super duper easy top to wear, as you can see. Looks great with jeans. For anyone heading into winter, you can layer this under jackets and coats. I've done the high neck option and just the regular length in just the plain tank today. So let's go ahead and make this top up together. I ended up doing a multi-size at my waist. That's just my body type. I followed all the fitting instructions in the pattern, which is what I would suggest you do in the tutorial. But definitely once you've done those alterations, try it on. Your pattern can look a bit weird and a bit wavy once you've multi-sized it, but surprisingly when you put it on, it looks amazing on your body because you've custom tailored it to fit. But again, this is a quick way to do a test, I guess. So if you don't want to cut into your good fabric, use something of a similar fabric, whether it's rayon spandex and you don't like the print or something, cut it out, baste it all together. Just make sure you're happy with the fit. If it's too tight, do a bigger size. If it's too big, do a smaller size. It'll just save you having to make up the garment and not be happy with it. So that's my tip of the day. Let's get sewing. So we've got our front piece and our back piece. It doesn't matter which one you put facing the right way up for the first step. So just lay it out on your sewing table and grab the opposite piece, whether it be the front or the back, and you want to make sure that the right sides of your pattern are facing each other. So when you lay the other piece on top, matching up at the shoulder seams, you'll see the wrong side of your fabric and the wrong side of the other piece is facing down on your table. So what we want to do is we want to match up at our shoulder seam. So given that rayon spandex is a very lightweight fabric, we have to be really careful not to stretch it when we're putting it together. I just usually like to put a couple of clips in at each end, given that I don't want to go overboard because it's only a small seam that we're going to sew. I'll do the same thing on the other shoulder seam. Now if you did a fit test, as I mentioned earlier, and you're using the same fabric, just pull out those basting stitches so that we're starting again going straight to our serger. Again, just 2 clips at each of the shoulder seams. So while we're here, I'm also going to pin the sides of my bodice as well. So I want to move along, and just as I mentioned before, that depending on the adjustments that you've done on your pattern, mine does look very weird because of my multi-sizing to my waist, but I did try it on and it fits beautifully. So I'm not too concerned what it looks like because I know it's going to fit my body shape. Again, starting up at the top, pin right at the edge. I like to pin that starting edge with my clips together, and then I move right down to the bottom and I'll clip that together as well, so that it won't move and stretch out of place. Give it a little bit of a bounce and then match in from, and then just clip it all along that seam. So we're just going to clip that all along there. Again, I don't want to stretch out my fabric, so I find that laying it flat on a table helps to avoid stretching it when we're clipping it together. You can see there that the fabric will just fit together beautifully, and that will just finish clipping that whole side, making sure that our two raw edges of both pieces are even. We just don't want to have that moving when we're pushing it through our overlocker. So ensuring that our two raw edges along the side seam are all matched, and then just repeat that on the other side. Now I'm over at my serger overlocker here. If you don't have an overlocker, you can most certainly still make this pattern. You just need to use a stretch stitch on your sewing machine, and that's the stitch that looks like a lightning bolt. Make sure you also have a stretch needle in your sewing machine, and just use the stretch stitch with the same seam allowance. I'm using an overlocker to create my seams today, but before I do any of that, I'm just going to do a test. So this little piece I've cut out, I'm going to sew along, and I have my differential feed set. So that's, I'll just show you on my overlocker where that actually is. So that's actually here. That's the neutral position. I've just gone one up for my rayon spandex for my differential feed. What differential feed will do will stop all the wavy lines on our fabrics that we get when we sew them. So I'll just show you. I'm just going to show you here with the differential feed set. So you can see there that my fabric is sitting nice and flat. It has. So now what we're going to do is get our garment and sew it for real. So what we want to do here is on our overlocker, we want to, or sewing machine, whichever one you're using, we just want to sew those seams that we clipped earlier. So we want to run our overlocker across our two shoulder seams, which we've clipped, and our two side seams again, which we clipped earlier. So keep your settings on your machine and go ahead and sew them using a 7mm seam allowance. So for me that means cutting about 2mm off the edge, about 1mm off the edge of my fabric to get the right seam allowance. So we're now preparing our binding. So for your binding, you will have cut out a shorter piece on the fold, and that is your neck binding. And you will also have two armhole bindings. Please ensure that you have marked all the notches on your bindings relevant to the pattern pieces. If you haven't, now is the time to lay them back down and cut them, because without those notches, it's going to be very difficult to match up. So first of all, we're going to do our neck binding. The other thing I recommend is making sure that you have a lot of pins. The first thing to do with the neck binding is that we get the right sides and we fold the right sides of the neck binding together. So at this open end, what we want to do is pin that or clip it. It really doesn't matter at this point. And then go over to our sewing machine, not our overlocker, because that will create too much bulk of the seam when we turn it right sides and attach it to the neckline. So what we want to do is we want to sew those two open ends together on our sewing machine, and we want to use a 7mm seam allowance and using a straight stitch on your sewing machine, and then come back and we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so I've sewed that on my sewing machine. Now what I want to do is just open that out and open those two seams that there's two edges, so that I've now got a flat opening, a flat seam like that. You could press that. Mine's sitting nicely now, so I'll just leave that as it is. Now what we want to do is we want to attach the neck binding to the neckline of the tank. So we need to match our right sides together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the back of my tank, and I have got that center back notch there, and what I'm going to do is I want to put the edge with the notches up the top, so making sure that that's where my notches are on my neck binding. That's going to sit at the top of my tank. By the top of my tank, what I mean is that I'm going to slide my tank through that neck binding. So as you can see, the binding is now sitting in my garment, over the top of my garment. So right sides together, that center back seam that I just sewed, I want to match that to the middle of my back piece where that notch is. Now this is how it will look. I'm just going to pin that. So this is how you will have it sitting. So you will have the raw edges together of the binding, and that other raw edge will be facing the main part of your fabric. So what we do is match all of our notches. So we have our center back notch. Now in my binding, I'm going to look for my second notch, which is my shoulder notch, and I'm going to match that one to my shoulder seam. So pressing my shoulder seams of my garment towards the back. I want them facing towards the back. I'm also going to pop a pin in there as well. Doesn't matter that that pin's on the inside, that was just easier for me. As I sew around it, I'll remove that on my sewing machine. Match the other armhole notch to the other armhole seam. So again, just pinning that. Now when I cut my front piece out, I omitted the center front notch. I've got 2 notches at the side and I haven't got a center front, so I'm just going to quickly make a notch at the center front. Okay, so we've now got a center front notch to match with our center front notch on our binding piece. Okay, and pop a pin in there as well. Now what we need to do, we've also got another notch to the center to match up. So it should be fairly easy to follow this step in matching up all of our notches. So by the end, what I like to do is match all the notches up first, and then I will go around in between my pins and pin the garment. Okay, so let's recap that. This is what my binding will look like with all the notches matched. So I have a center back, I have a side seam, I have a, I guess, mid neckline seam, I have a center front, another mid neckline seam, and another shoulder seam. So now what I want to do between each of my pins is just shake my binding so it's sitting nice and flat, and I want to pin in between here. So to match, so that binding is attached to my tank, I'm going to pin in between each of those notches with lots of pins. I find using lots of pins at this step will help to keep the garment sitting nice and flat when we go to sew it. So you can see between those 2 notches, lots of pins. So my pins are roughly 1.5 centimeters apart, maybe half an inch apart. So again, I'm moving to the next 2. I'm making sure that my raw edges are even on both my binding and my garment, and I'm going to put lots of pins about 1.5 centimeters apart to keep that sitting nice and flat. Make sure that as we're pinning that the actual garment doesn't contain any lumps and bumps, and our binding is also sitting nice and flat. This can be a time-consuming step, but believe me, it's worth it in the end. So what we want to do is just keep pinning around that neckline between all the pins, checking for lumps and bumps at the back, and then we'll come back and move on to the next step. On this next step, we're going to use our sewing machine. So we want to make sure that we've set this to a basting stitch. So that is a long straight stitch. So the longest stitch that your machine's capable of. What we're going to use is the edge of our foot here as our seam guide. So 7 to 10 mil is fine. We're going to pull this stitch out later. So it is really important to do it. Don't get me wrong, but it doesn't matter if you've done a 7 mil seam allowance or a 1 centimeter seam allowance. So I'm just going to use the edge of my foot as a guide. That'll just help me keep it nice and even. A couple of things to note here. Our neck binding is smaller than our garment, so we are going to put a little bit of stretch into our binding as we attach it to our garment. So the other thing to note is that we're going to use our hand a lot here. I'm going to guide my fabric with my left hand, and my right hand is just going to sort of feel along here as we sew. I just want to make sure that I'm feeling for any lumps and bumps as it goes, because here will be, you know, because we are we do have a bigger neckline than our binding, sometimes you can get little puckers into the fabric, and that's what we don't want. So we want to stretch our binding slightly as we're sewing. Now you're going to say to me, how do we stretch our binding and not stretch our neckline? Well, that's why we use lots of pins. So our pins have already stretched our binding to match with our neckline, and as you notice that we checked as we were going to make sure that it was nice and flat underneath. So technically we shouldn't have to pull anything while we are sewing our neckline, because we have pinned it with those 1,000 pins that we used. So what I want to do is I'm going to turn my speed right down, because I want to go fairly slowly here, just to make sure that I don't get any puckers as I'm sewing. So I'm going to try and remove my pins as I sew, which is again next. I'm just going to go just a tad faster than that. Now if you do feel some puckers, stop your machine, don't keep sewing, just rearrange it. So what I want to do is make sure that this neckline is sitting nice and flat, and if it means that I have to grab my garment and shift it around a little bit, then that's what I have to do. So in that case I felt a little pucker here as I was coming up to here, so I've just grabbed my bodice and just moved it off to the side a little bit, and now I can feel that that's nice and flat there for this next little bit of sewing. Again, I am coming up to that shoulder seam, so of course I'm going to feel a big lump there. That's okay, I'll continue going, and you can just see how my finger here is guiding along to make sure that I've got this really nice flat. Now I can feel a lump, there's a gather in here, I can feel that, and again I'm just going to move my fabric around. Now that's gone, and you can see my neckline's pushed right off to the side here, so I'm just going to bring that back a little bit as well to make sure that I'm sewing it straight, not a roundabout way. So again, that's sitting nice and flat. I can take that pin out, get my machine going again. I am going at a really slow pace because this is an important step, and I just don't want to have to unpick it and start again and put all my pins back. So it's really out of pure laziness that I'm going this slow. Again, I can see on my machine that it's caught on the bed and it's stretching out my neckline, so I'm just going to remove that. And just make sure that nothing's being stretched and nothing's sitting strangely. More puckers. So you can see how often I'm stopping and fixing this up as I'm going. This is not a quick process, but it is worth it in the end. But it is worth going slow and getting this right, because otherwise you'll have a neckline that is stretched out and it won't look very nice on the garment. So you can save this tutorial and use this in the other garments as well. So I'm just coming up to the end now. I'm not going to backstitch because we are going to remove that later. So now I am just going to lift my needle out and remove my fabric, cut those tails, and now what I want to do is, I'll just put the camera up a little bit, is just check that as I've sewn that around to make sure that I haven't caught any puckers in my sewing. So if you have, you will need to undo it and start again, or just undo the section. If you've got a little pucker in somewhere, just pull the basting out in that section, repin it, and just re-sew it again. Don't ignore it if you have sewn puckers in, and believe me, it's very easy to do. So if you have a pucker, fix it now before we move on to the next step. Now we're experts in doing that stitching around our neckline. We're going to repeat that step. Now this step is really important, so don't skip it, otherwise your binding will not work. The first thing that we need to do is grab a little ruler, and we need to mark 2 centimeters on our ruler, or grab your tape measure and have a look where 2 centimeters is. That's 3/4 of an inch according to the pattern. Now what I want to do is measure that from the edge of our binding, so the edge that we've just sewn and basted along. I want to just measure 2 centimeters from the actual edge, and I just want to put a pin in there. This step is really important to be accurate. Now the reason I put a pin in there is I'm going to go over to my sewing machine and put my needle down on my sewing machine where that pin is, and just work out where my marker is on my sewing machine, so that I'm going to sew exactly 2 centimeters in from that raw edge that we sewed before. So I wouldn't follow your basting stitch, because if you were anything like me, you were paying more attention to not having any puckers than to actually sewing it in a dead straight accurate line. So this next step is really important to get accurate and straight, because this will form the first part of our binding. Now there are 2 options with this next step. You can sew this using a lightning bolt stitch, so a stretch stitch, so it will form a permanent part of the binding. If you are using a cover stitch later on to anchor down your binding, then you can sew this next one using a basting stitch, because we can remove it later, and our cover stitch will anchor down the binding as part of the neckline. Okay, so I'm going to pop my needle down where I had marked that, where I've popped that pin in. Pop my needle down, so I know that that's exactly 2 centimeters from that raw edge. I didn't bring my pins over. Now what I want to do is just have a look on my sewing machine. Now we're going to sew it exactly the same way that we sewed it before, so that is again being really careful not to stretch the neckline, feeling for lumps and bumps, going really slow. We want to do exactly the same thing again. Now I can just have a look there that I do have a mark on my sewing machine where that 2 centimeter line will be. So I need to just make sure. So what I'm looking for on my sewing machine, I'll just bring you around to show you, is I'm looking for that mark there. That will be my guideline. So I'll make sure that this edge of the fabric consistently stays in line with that marking on my sewing machine. So work that out for your own sewing machine, and then what we want to do is doing exactly what we did before, and sew really accurately 2 centimeters all the way along the binding. So let's do that, and then we'll move on to the next step. Now this next step is super important when we're doing a wide binding. It helps it sit nice and flat. So you can see here that I've got all lumps and bumps and puckers. This is because we have had to stretch out the binding to match the neckline of the fabric. Perfectly normal, as long as it's all sitting nice and flat and there's not actually puckers of the fabric. We're going to iron this all out. So what I find the best way to iron this is to turn my garment to the wrong side and put the end over my ironing board, so the neck end. So this is where I have the neck end sitting with the binding. So what this will look like is you'll have the wrong side of your binding facing up, the wrong side of your garment facing up, and you want to push those 2 seams that we just sewed. So you'll have your basting stitch here, and then this second row was our exact 2 centimeter row that we just sewed. So we want to have them facing up, so everything is nice and flat. And then I want to press this with a steam iron to get rid of all these puckers that are showing up in the fabric. So have your iron set to steam and just press that all with that seam facing up. So go. Okay, so after we've ironed that, what we're going to do is remove that first lot of basting stitches before we do the next ironing step. And so we've got the 2 rows. and the first row closest to the raw edge is the one that we want to remove, because that's the one that we did firstly. So all I'm going to do is grab my unpicker and remove that seam, remove that basting stitch all the way around the neckline. Should be fairly easy to remove. If you want to break it in a couple of spots, you can. Otherwise, it should just pull out nice and easily. Make sure you grab the cotton and the thread from the other side as well, because we don't want to leave that in our garment when we finish that neckline. So now what we have is just that one row of sewing that's 2 centimeters away from that raw edge. Now what we want to do while we're at our iron is grab our binding, and we've already ironed it to have that seam pointing up towards the edge of the binding. Now all we want to do is wrap that binding around that seam. So you can see here, wrong sides together. I'm just going to wrap the binding around that seam edge. So the edge of that seam that we pressed up will be in the middle of my binding, if that makes sense. So now we've got our binding looking like that. So what I want to do while I'm at my ironing board is to press that. So I'm going to very carefully pop my neckline back on the end of the ironing board, and I'm going to fold that over so that that raw edge of the seam is in the middle of my binding, and making sure that that's nice and even as I iron it. And I'm going to go all the way around my neckline and iron that down. So if you go ahead and do that, and then we will go up and stitch it down. So now we've ironed that neck binding down, this should make that next step fairly easy to manage. So what we want to do is keeping that folded down, and we want to have that raw edge, as I mentioned, against the middle of the binding. So make sure that that raw edge of that binding is hard up against the fold that we're folding over of our binding. I prefer to work this step with the wrong side facing up. Now what we want to do is pin this binding, and this is another step where we're going to use lots of pins. So I'm going to start at those anchor points that we did at the beginning. So remember how we started with all our pins at the notches, and then we went ahead and filled in between. So I'm going to do the same thing with this step here. So pinning it from the wrong side of the fabric, I'm starting at the center back. So I've folded that over, pinned it down at the center back. I'm now going to do the same thing at the side seam. So again, folding, feeling with my finger to make sure that raw edge is neatly enclosed and hard up against that fold line. I'm going to pop another pin in at that section there too. Now moving along, I'm going to go to that mid notch that we had at the front there, and again fold that over with my fingers, feel, and by ironing it down you've at least got a memory crease in that neckline there in the binding, so that it should sit nice and flat when we pin it. Moving along to the other side notch, missed a notch in here, so that one's there. Again, making sure when we do this step, we want to make sure that both layers of this seam that we've got here are sitting nice and flat. It's really important that we make sure we don't fold them inadvertently as well, especially when you're using a light fabric, because you will notice that when you're sewing your binding down. So you want to make sure everything is beautiful and flat, and hence why ironing, that previous ironing step, is super important, because again, it just reinforces that everything's going to sit nice and flat. Now I'll just do that last shoulder seam, fold that over, and I've got this beautiful wide bound neckline. Right, so I've now got all my key points pinned of my neckline. So what that looks like is just pinned, folded, and now what I'm going to do is just go in between each pin and add loads more pins. We want to just make sure the same step is done in between each pin, is having that edge line hard up against, otherwise you're going to end up with a gap and an uneven neckline. So again, use lots of pins, about every 1.5 centimeters to 2 centimeters for this step, because you don't want that anything to move while we're top stitching that down. We've now pinned all the way along our neckline, and what we want to do is just turn the garment to the right side out. It doesn't matter that our pins are on the inside, because if you pinned like I did with the pins facing up, they'll be easy to pull out as we're sewing along. Now I am actually going to sew mine on a cover stitch machine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew where we've attached the seam. I'm going to sew just in from that on my cover stitch, and that will create 2 rows of top stitching all the way along this neck binding. If you don't have a cover stitch machine, you can do this using a twin needle or a zigzag stitch on your machine, your sewing machine. So as I'm sewing this on my cover stitch, and it will be the same with your sewing machine, you do want to keep moving your garment around. So again, we don't want to stretch the neckline of the garment. We just want to make sure that it's sitting nice and flat and feeding through nice and evenly. Now you can see I've finished cover stitching, and you can see how beautiful that neckline is sitting. So you can tell like it's not been stretched out as we've been sewing. It's sitting nice and flat. You can see the fabric here, and I haven't pressed that yet. So final press at the end, and this will just be sitting absolutely beautiful once I have finished pressing that. So you can go back, if you did a basting stitch here, you can go back and remove that. So what you should find underneath when you've sewn it is that the cover stitch or your sewing machine has caught all of that binding around, so you will have a little bit of excess, and it's just finished so lovely. So if you want to, with your armhole bindings, you will have your 4 notches. So you'll have your double notches for the back and your single notch for the front. You'll have a notch for your shoulder seam, and then that seam that you join together, where you joined it together, will form the 4th notch. So I like to put that seam where we joined the 2 ends together under the arm, so that seam will match with your side seam, and then the other 4 notches correspond to the shoulder seam, the front and the back marking. So if you pin according to those notches and then stretch out the binding only in between those pins, and then proceed to do the 2 rows of stitching as we did for the neck binding, and then we go and iron, and then we flip it over, iron again, and then top stitch it. So if you need a recap on those, just flick back to how we pinned and stitched for the neck binding, because the process is exactly the same for the underarm. So the arm binding, sorry, it's just a matter of making sure that those notches match. So again, your binding should be sitting in on your garment. So there's our neck binding, and I've got the raw edges matching with the other edge facing inwards on my garment. So if you go ahead and pin that, and then proceed to do all those steps as we did for the neck binding, and then we're nearly finished. Now we've done both of our armhole bindings, our final step is to hem our tank. So I haven't pressed mine yet, but everything is sitting lovely and flat again. So with our hem, we have a 1.5 centimeter hem allowance. I love this trusty tool. It enables me to put the marker where the 1.5 centimeter seam allowance is, and then all I have to do is turn my hem up towards the wrong side, and I just use the flat edge of the ruler against the fold and just make sure that the orange bit measures where the cut edge is, and then I'll just pin that all the way around. So with the 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, you can stitch that down using a cover stitch machine, or again, if whatever top stitching stitch you used for your bindings, repeat that for the hem. So just go ahead and pin the 1.5 centimeter seam allowance up or clip, and then go and stitch it on either your cover stitch or your sewing machine, and go and press your tank, and you are all finished.